All right, once again, welcome to the December edition of the Conservation Outcomes webinar series. My name is Amy Overstreet, and I'm a Natural Resources Communication Specialist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, also known as NRCS. And I am a proud member of the Resource Inventory and Assessment. We host this Conservation Outcomes webinar series so that we can highlight NRCS activities related to efforts to assess and quantify the impacts of conservation programs. We're going to get started with today's presentation in just a moment, but I have a few logistics to cover first. If you would like to receive email notifications with information about upcoming webinars, we encourage you to subscribe to the NRCS Conservation Outcomes topic via the Gov delivery system. You can do that by following the instructions on the screen, and we will also place a link that you can use to access the Gov delivery subscription webpage in today's chat. And as we mentioned earlier, we are recording this webinar. If you have any problems at all with audio, sometimes computer or mobile device headsets can help with that audio quality and volume. It might also be helpful if you want to log out and back in. On the screen, you can see how to access the live captions during this webinar by simply accessing the three dots with the word "More" at the top of your screen. And this should enable you to select the Turn on Live Captions function. Please note that we're also going to post more links and resources in the chat today as well. One really important web page that I wanted to highlight is our Conservation Outcomes webinar series page. You can see that link here on the screen, and we will also share that with you in the chat. If you go there, you can find some great resources from today's event, including a one-page additional resources guide, and also our presenter's slide deck as a PDF. And finally, we encourage everyone to type your questions or comments into the chat. We're going to address as many of those questions as we can at the end of the event today. If we don't get to your question, we're going to share our guest presenter's email address, and you can reach out to him directly. With that, it's time to get started. And at this time, I'm pleased to turn the microphone over to Louis Aspey, Associate Chief of NRCS.
Amy, thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest installment of the NRCS Conservation Outcome webinar series. My apologies if you hear a little bit of background noise. I'm in the middle of traveling right now. I'm trying to carve out somewhat of a quiet space. You're in for a real treat today. As you know, NRCS has a long history of working with farmers and ranchers to help them conserve the natural heritage and sustainability of their operations. These recurring webinars give us a way to communicate to our stakeholders the importance of voluntary conservation programs and the funding provided through the Farm Bill for these efforts, and to highlight some of the documented outcomes in terms of natural resource and economic benefits. For nearly 20 years, the Conservation Effects Assessment Project, or CEAP, has been documenting outcomes of our work on a variety of resource concerns. CEAP works closely with our science partners and other agencies in academia, and outcomes generated help inform improved conservation delivery across the agency. Today's webinar is another great illustration of how science-based assessments inform better natural resource management and also generate important insights into how we can help our producer partners maintain productive working lands for the benefit of their families, communities, and society. We're going to see how the highly valued grasslands in the Great Plains are under emerging threats, such as woody plant encroachment, and how we, with the help of our science partners, are working to address those threats to help them healthy, keep them healthy, and productive for decades to come. In working with landowners and producers, we rely on the best science coming from our university partners to provide some of the best assistance possible to our cooperators on the land. Today, we're really excited to share findings and insights being generated in partnership with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Twidwell research team and the Department of Agronomy and Horticulture. I really appreciate all of you being with us today. I had an opportunity to get a sneak peek of this last week, and I think you're in for a real treat. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Charlie Rua, NRCS CEAP Wildlife Leader, to introduce Dr. Twidwell. Thank you.
Thank you, Lewis. Again, I'm Charlie Rewa, the NRCS Wildlife Component Leader for the Conservation Effects Assessment Project. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. As Lewis said, we're excited to share some outcomes, findings, and insights generated from our science partners in the Great Plains. We'll see how the science generated informs our work with ranchers and landowners in managing grassland habitats to address biome scale threats and keep working grasslands healthy for the benefit of wildlife and producers alike. So since 2005, the SEEP Wildlife Component has been supporting outcome-based assessments through over 80 cooperative agreements with science partners. And assessment findings and reports and other documents can all be found on the SEEP Wildlife webpage that's included in today's links. I'll just refer everybody to that. In recent years, SEEP Wildlife has been working in partnership with Dr. Durak Twidwell at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and other science partners to better understanding the threats such as woody plant encroachment facing the Great Plains grassland biome, and to support efforts to address those threats. So Dr. Twidwell is an associate professor at the University of Nebraska. His program emphasizes how relatively simple transitions in rangeland vegetation affect societal well-being. Large-scale rangeland collapse is leading to increased wildfire disasters, unsustainable trends in livestock production, and biodiversity, along with heightened risk of water resources and increased risk to human health and urban social programs. So Durak is renowned nationally and internationally for his work in rangelands. He serves as the science advisor for NRCS on Great Plains grassland conservation and as a science expert for international grassland conservation frameworks like the Central Grasslands Roadmap. His research has promoted adaptations of federal programs and policies, spawned new conservation initiatives like the new Great Plains Grassland Initiatives in Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and South Dakota, and he's regularly featured in national and international media outlets. So today's webinar relates to wildlife in terms that wildlife outcomes in that healthy, productive grasslands support healthy grassland wildlife communities. So now I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Twidwell for the main webinar presentation. I'll be back at the end of the webinar for the Q&A session. So Durak, the mic is yours.
Great. Charlie, thank you so much. And thank you for those incredibly nice, supportive, and generous comments. Also, thanks to Lewis for your opening as well. I'm a big fan of the webinar series and a big fan of the leadership of what this group is doing and attempting to doing. And thanks everybody for joining. I know it's a really busy time of year and we have a lot going on. So yeah, I jumped at the opportunity when asked, like, hey, can we give an update on the science and discussion and narratives tied to, grassland conservation in the Great Plains, the movement that's afoot, and really growing, and it seems like it's growing at an incredibly rapid race to address the urgency of grassland conservation here, and just what that outcomes that we're starting to see and emerge and drive happens to be. So I'll walk you through really what we're seeing playing out in the Great Plains. And you've heard this discussion on the biome, and these kind of pictures you're seeing on this title slide, I just want to keep have people keep this in mind. Like I'm fortunate enough in my job to be able to travel around the world and see some of the last remaining big grasslands that exist, and North America still has some, but views of horizons are incredibly rare in grassland conservation in North America's grasslands today. There's been so much change over such a short period of time. Like, this view of grasslands being more intact is rare. So I'm going to show, like, just keep that kind of image in your head as we go through various data and some of the narratives. In addition, I should step back and say, I mean, this is while I'm, often asked to talk on this and everything else, like, the amount of people providing leadership behind the scenes is incredible, right? Like, the science you'll see is on support of a national science team effort. So especially big thanks and just really appreciate the collaboration with University of Montana, scientists throughout the Great Plains, like the Prairie Project, if you've heard of that. The amount of leaders tied to NRCS at state, local, regional, national levels. I mean, other partners tied to multiple groups. Like this is a big major team effort, and all of this can't be done without everybody kind of collaborating and working together to meet the kind of outcomes we're starting to see. And so with that, as a scientist, I mean, I think it's really important to set the stage of what scientists have talked about now for a long time. And in ecology, one of the biggest things that have been voiced, for decades really, is this desire to avoid alternative state change or these regime shifts. So this really became a major focus in ecology because this is where we see major consequences to human well-being tied to natural resources when these ecosystems flip. So examples, right, are well known across the world, like coral reefs going to an algal-dominated state when they were more healthy, productive for fisheries and tourism and so forth. Huge conversation in the world, obviously. Woody encroachment, so going from a grass-dominated state to a woody-dominated state, you're talking about the same kind of severe change in terms of ecosystem structure and function. And even like our history, right? Right here in the Great Plains, you think of that eroded, destabilized state, which people are still concerned about all over the world in areas, and that we lived through in this region. These are the kind of things that we want to avoid, because if you don't avoid them, we bear the consequences, and the people that live there bear the consequence to them. So scientists nowadays, we don't just talk about regime shifts, we talk about the scale of regime shifts. So it's one thing if you have a local like blowout, like a little golf course bunker in the sandhills, but it's another thing if that bunker or that blowout becomes a regional destabilized blowing sand dune. That changes our way of life, right? Like, so the most catastrophic transitions that we hypothesize are going to occur this century are those that transcend scale. So they're not a local transition. They're no longer a local problem. The scale at which that occurs is important. And the reason that's important is because the field of natural resources and applied ecologists and really, you look at even a lot in terms of agriculture, our ability to solve problems are kind of like ambulance drivers, right? The more local the problem, the more we can address it. The bigger scale of these issues, even our engineering, our agricultural innovation, our natural resource profession, we don't have great examples of solving large scale problems in the world. So we want to try and avoid these types of transitions at all costs. Now, another piece of the background is that as the theory has grown and our understanding of how complex systems work has grown, so is our technology and just the way science works. So instead of me just being in an ivory tower, as an ecologist watching how systems are changing and talking about the mechanisms of that, we now have technology like the rangeland analysis platform that we didn't have a couple years ago. So we now have the kind of monitoring that supports more sound ecological models. And what I'm seeing, and I'm really happy to be part of a team that does this, is that technology drives more rapid implementation. So things like Kansas Great Plains Grasslands initiatives and other Great Plains Grasslands initiatives, what is that technology showing us? And how do we better implement practices and how do we have better strategies? Well, that drives outcomes, right? Those outcomes we can measure, monitor, and work together and collaborate to achieve. And it's that kind of landowner-led, agency-supported, right, and science-informed, and we can document those outcomes. And as we have success, that guides the big picture frameworks. And those big picture frameworks tell us what kind of technology we need. And we just have this rapid cycle where science is no longer so slow in rangelands. It's this rapid, community-based co-production framework that really is working really well with this national science team of people in Working Lands for Wildlife, and just the various partners that are tied to this conversation. So this is an example, and I'm not going to cover this very much, but if you haven't heard of the Rangeland Analysis Platform, Google it. You can explore it. But in the past, if we wanted to know what was happening in range, we all got out the tape measures and got our little army in the field and started measuring range cover and range production. And so we could get a glimpse, but now we have 30 meter by 30 meter pixel information for the entire United States tied to rangelands. So we are now caught up with a lot of others in terms of being able to monitor for every baseball diamond for every year, the DNA of range. So we have the cover in terms of annuals, perennials, bare ground, litter, shrubs, trees. those vegetation groups being so important to our understanding of rangelands. And of course, the other key metric is rangeland production. So the opportunity to track how production is changing, right? What we grow, and the ability to communicate that like the rest of agriculture. We now know how much we grow in rangelands, whereas before we were talking about what we grew in a little plot or a quadrat. So our field has changed, and this allows us to create new derivative products that are being used from this to be able to better inform our strategies, better guide implementation, and better document outcomes. So that's really where I'm going to talk about. So you can see how kind of this is built by the background, but to get to why this conversation is happening and some of the sobering reality of the Great Plains, when the Rangeland Analysis Platform was built, well, we can take modern theories and resilience and say, well, we should be able to track where boundaries are breaking down and these alternative states are playing out, and we should be able to monitor the scale at which that's happening for the first time. And we've been able to accomplish that. So as we were looking for at what scale do we see collapse happening and alternative states happening? Remember that first slide, like we want to avoid these scales of change. So we're looking at the biome. So everything sea green here is dominated by grass. Everywhere that's red is dominated by woodies. These are alternative biome states. And scientists hypothesize they're going to break down, collapse, and reorganize this century. So these boundaries have existed for a long time. You can see the Black Hills of South Dakota, Halsey National Forest here in the middle of the Sandhills, where 100 years ago or so we put that in. And look at how this has changed in over 30 years. So I'm just going to go back and forth a little bit here. 30 years, look at the degree at which this biome is changing. So this is what it feels like to live through biome collapse, right? Like the Flint Hills, which burns 2 million acres a year, looks like the Black Hills, kind of this, right, paleo relic. So we are talking about such a massive degree of transformation and change in the system. And one way to think about it is just biology 101. There's the biosphere. And then underneath that, in terms of terrestrial biology, are biomes. So our biomes are collapsing. Our world is shrinking, right? If our biosphere shrunk, it would fundamentally change our way of life. So our biome is shrinking. So it's going to change our way of life in the Great Plains as this happens. Now, we spend $177 million in the last Farm Bill on brush management in the Great Plains. It's one of the more expensive things that we do, right? And our strategy coming from the science is you have trees. Like here's a great way if you want to get back to that productive grassland, here's how you kill trees. So that came from the science. That drove our extension. That drove our technical guidance. That drove everything. And I did that because I want to show you new data, new work in terms of how this is starting to play out relative to how we spend our practices. So this is funded by SEEP and everything else. Where do we put our practices relative to biome collapse? So I want to walk you through this. And this is, again, I've got tenure, so I can throw the science under the bus a little bit here. I can, this extension science connection to what we do in the NRCS for rangelands is really important. This boundary here you're seeing that's gray, that's the old historic Great Plains boundary. In 1990, this is what I showed you in terms of that biome boundary separating alternative states. And then here's 2020 in the black here. This is again, SEEP-funded project led by Sam Cady in my lab as a postdoc. And what she's showing here is where do we put each of these practices relative to our biome? Do we put them out in front of the biome? Do we chase the biome? Like, how are our practices being used spatially? Because this starts to give us a glimpse of maybe why this is happening relative to what we control, which is how to manage. So what I want to do here is show that what we tend to have is here's our grassland improvements at the top. Our grassland improvements are put in front of the biome. Kind of makes sense. We have more grassland where it's a grassy dominated biome. Our grassland restoration practices are kind of around the biome, right? They're more around and slightly chasing. And then eventually we do forest improvement in what used to be grassland biome. So just watch as this plays out and how I break this down. So that's windbreaks if we put it ahead of the biome. So it's what we disproportionately do more than anything else. And there's brush management, which chases the biome, which we knew by now, but this again confirms just to what degree we're doing that and how much we're chasing the problem. So of course, kind of seems like our biome would collapse, right? Like, but let's break it down a little bit further and really dive into this a little. The ultimate grassland improvement practice is putting in windbreaks. Now we did this since settlement, right? Like And I'm literally right now sitting in the Arbor Lodge in Nebraska City as part of a multi-state extension workshop. This is what we do because, hey, I sure could use some trees. So we're like, oh, well, if you want some shade or you want to break the wind a little bit, hey, we'll add that on, right? And it becomes an improvement practice. Or what we do is then other improvements like, hey, I could, I need some water or pipeline, right? All these improvements that are going ahead of the biome. So to make a simple point, all of these improvements we do that are tied to grazing are at risk. All that money that we invest is at risk because the biome is collapsing and none of them manage woody encroachment. So we're spending a lot of money for grasslands and grazing lands ahead of the biome. We have for decades on this. All of those are at risk. All those incentives are at risk. All that money. We're asking landowners and clients, right? And extension, science, like it comes from all of it, to put in their dollars as part of cost share, incentives, everything else. And yet nothing manages grasslands. To look at it further, none of this increases the resilience of grasslands. And that's well known in the science and everything else. Those we put behind the biome. So then you hit brush management and fire. Those are the things that are behind the biome. They're chasing it. So what we have is this improvement then restoration paradigm. And we didn't know this, right? We didn't know this back in the day, and we're just trying to improve systems. And it's like, oh, well, so if you're putting in a windbreak because of a shade benefit, or it's like, hey, maybe we can even get some carbon out of this, right? Like you have a utilitarian benefit. We can add that on. But what we don't tell people is like, oh, by the way, in the future, you're going to have to add on how to plan for what encroaches from those. You're going to have to add on prescribed fire. You have to add on brush management if you want to still have the benefits of what you used to have on that area. And meanwhile, all these other things are at risk too. That's why this gets so big. So yeah, like we're basically improving areas, then we're asking people to restore it later. And that's literally the range profession 101 now. And then it gets to the point where we just start doing forest improvement, and which makes sense. It's forested biome. So this is the story. And I really like what Lewis said at the beginning. I mean, right, our mission in rangelands, science, extension, the agencies, is for things to be sustainable. So our approach to practices, our approach to what we've done with extension on this, our science strategy, none of it's sustainable. So a practice-based approach without context, without this broader thinking, is currently not sustainable. So not only that, like, right, like what do we do more than anything else? And I say this to kind of give an out because, it's tough to hear and everything else, but in rangelands, the rangeland profession, it's really hard not to go, you know what, grazing will solve everything. So like if you have an issue, grazing will solve it. It's kind of just how we start. And if you're a forester, right, trees solve everything. We all have our kind of thing that we start with. Prescribed grazing doesn't solve this issue. That's well published. So you have 600,000 contracts being applied and everything else. That's over half of the practices that were in the Great Plains we looked at, and it doesn't solve this issue. So I love what Jerry Maestas says on this. It's like, are we, rearranging the furniture while the house is burning down? You kind of want to not have the house burn down if you're going to do that. We're rotating animals around and everything else and getting better utilization, but the house is burning down all around us. Then you have all these infrastructure and brush management's not used in the right place, right? We could have a better approach to this if we put in the right place to kind of prevent the losses with all those applications. And if it's not a surprise why rangeland scientists think we need to have a more integrated approach to how we manage the ecosystems and where we put our practices, fire was what indigenous groups did as the ultimate grassland improvement. We had grassland biomes, and we have grasslands that we thrive with today all across the world because different indigenous groups burned. That's why you have temperate grassland biomes. That used to be the ultimate improvement practice. Well, we do less of that than we do windbreaks and shelter belts. And the dominant species we use in the Great Plains is eastern red cedar. So we're just can do stuff smarter, right? We can do it better going forward. We have to put our practices in a way that have a better strategy. That's the challenge that we all have. And that's because this is a complex system and you got to manage it accordingly. So I went into that dive. Woody encroachment is such a big issue now that we can track how it ranks relative to other drivers of grassland loss. So Scott Morford, at the University of Montana, this was a product that came from some of his work. And what you're seeing here is that woody encroachment and tree expansion in the Great Plains is now occurring at such a massive rate that it is occurring at the same rate as land use conversion. These are your two top drivers of grassland loss in the Great Plains then. So on the left, you see where things escape the tractor. The green areas there is where you have low to no cultivation risk. On the right, whatever escaped the tractor, right, when the biome starts moving through, doesn't escape the trees. So our grasslands have trees. Well, guess where we have like endangered species and other issues, right? As that starts to take away the large scale habitat. And that's what I think is so important with all this discussion. The reason people care, and it's not just about wildlife, right? It's everything. When you have a local concern and other things, we tend to have local problems. The biome's collapsing, which means we have biome level consequences, and they are different. So if you care about preventing endangered species, then people are caring about this issue. And these are people that live here, right? So endangered species, the risk of that increases, which increases regulatory concerns in this region. If you care more about pollinator habitat, there's pollinators that rely on larger scale grasslands. Of course, plant diversity collapses that require grasslands that transition to woody dominance. We show things with like large scale mammal migrations, data from Wyoming showing 1% conifer increases affecting recruitment of pronghorn with some of the Jeff Beck's data. Of course, Nebraska sandhills and the greater prairie chicken, right? Like stronghold for that species, whereas the other prairie chickens have been listed on the Endangered Species Act, right? Most recently, lesser prairie chicken, or extinct, right? That's traditionally how we talked about this. Rancher livelihoods and cattle production, those decline with woody encroachment in this collapsing biome. But the new research shows how it affects every citizen that lives in the Great Plains. And so this is why this webinar and stuff is so important. For us that live here, we're going to live through increased natural disasters because a volatile fuel is spreading throughout the interior of the continent, right? And the Western lesson was we should manage our volatile fuels and prevent that. So we're going from grassland areas, which have lower fire danger than these volatile fuel cedar-driven areas and other woody plants tied to that. That reduces our wildfire suppression potential, increases fire danger in those areas. And we're seeing that. Nebraska had serious consequences with that this year for some of the first times. Doesn't just affect that, it affects our hydrology and our water. And we're seeing major changes in it as this plays out over multiple states. It affects things like school funding. And recently, a paper from Oklahoma State showed West Nile virus is higher in eastern red cedar woodlands than it is in deciduous areas and grasslands, and even tick-based vectors increase. It affects everything, right? It affects our way of life. That's what we expect when biomes collapse and transition, and this is why people care. And we know this very well. There's decades of science talking about what's playing out. All of the things I'm showing you this collage is published and has a huge scientific backing in this area. The most recent one is this paper that I wanted to highlight by Morford that talks about herbaceous production loss to tree encroachment. And this is why I think a lot of the industry is starting to care now, because we lost 22.4 million tons of range production. Before we had data like this on the left that was part of long-term work out of Texas A&M with Dr. Sam Fullendorf, where we used to say like, hey, 75% of production is going to be lost to woody encroachment. We see that over every state. And so long-term, this is what you experience. But we couldn't show a single person on their place what's playing out. 22.4 million tons, like collectively, that ends up being like a $5 billion hit to the industry over the last 3 decades on this. So let me walk you through how this data is being communicated and how it's helping drive some of this movement. So in South Dakota, when I came to Nebraska, I was told we do not have a woody encroachment problem in Nebraska. That was in late 2013. And I said, well, that's an interesting hypothesis. I think we should test that. And we kept looking at South Dakota. So now with this data, South Dakota lost 145,000 tons in 2019. That means that since 1990, as woody encroachment has increased, we keep losing a little more every year of rangeland production. So in 2019, that equated to 145,000 tons because woody plants in 2019 have increased since 1990. Nebraska used to look like South Dakota. We're up to 420,000 tons. Kansas used to look like Nebraska. They're at 2 million tons. And Oklahoma used to look like Kansas. We're talking about 4.5 million tons. So This is the story of what's happening on our rangelands. It's affecting our production system. This rangeland production is not just important to USDA and agriculture and rangeland producers. Production is what drives our ecosystem services. So we're losing what carries our ecosystem services that are dependent upon rangeland production, including wildlife. Now, Shelley Kelly, Sandhills Task Force Director for Nebraska Sandhills area, goes, I have no idea what 419,000 tons is. What is that in terms of round bales? So Nebraska Cattlemen asked me to come up to Valentine and present this work. I left Lincoln, Nebraska, and based on the size of a round bale, I could have driven on I-80 to North Platte, all the way up to Valentine, came all the way back to Lincoln, a 10.5-hour drive, and seen nothing but round bales. So if you've driven through Lincoln or driven through North Platte and everything else on I-80, this would be officially the most boring drive in the world, right? Because you'd see nothing but round bales for 10.5 hours. That's what it's like in terms of what woody plants took out of agricultural production and habitat and so forth. Now I can not only go there, we can zoom in, right? So let me show you how this is being effective. And this is available online. Right now it's on the Working Land for Wildlife page. You can actually see Knox County. Let's go to Knox County, Nebraska. Knox County lost 29,000 tons. Now, what we want to see in agriculture is we want to avoid yield gaps, right? We want to avoid losses in production. Well, the range science and all of our guidance on this said, no, it's okay. Wait until you have woody cover, and then after you have a problem, we'll help you manage it. That came from our guidance in this profession. So we actually said it was okay to have woody cover and so forth and lose production, and then we'll try and restore it and get it back. So what you see is this signal that we want to avoid in this area. But what I like to be able to show is, well, when should we be starting in Knox County? Well, we should have been starting in Knox County, in 1995, right? Or earlier. So, and the other point I like to show is that these losses follow signals of early warning. So if you look at these signals of early warning, here's what it looked like in 1990. Right? This is the same signal as that biome signal, and now zoomed in, and we can kind of screen for these early warning signals. And there's 2020. Now, we spent a lot of money on brush management in this area, right? And we spend it in the red, like we do. But you can see where these core areas are. People have actually tracked now where there's greater prairie chicken leks in here and everything else. They occur in the bigger green patches on this landscape. So when you look at this, right, like we can see that this has spatial order. It's not random. It spreads, it grows, it moves. That means we can manage this with a better strategy. So that was important. But this looked like 2000, Riley County, Kansas, if I looked down there. So I can go somewhere else. I can go to Cherry County, prize jewel, like 2.8 million tons of range production, right? Really important county in terms of rangelands, really iconic area for Nebraska and the Nebraska Sandhills. And we are now seeing yield gaps. And producers in Cherry County were told it could never happen there. Right? I mean, you'd never have spread coming out from these more local seed source areas and actually impact the rangeland production. It is, and we can see it with these models. Of course, these losses follow early warning, right? And so what do we want to do? We want to be able to communicate to people that in 1990, this is what it looked like. And here's what it looks like in 2020. So you can see that growth and change. Now, what I'm able to do, right, is then say, well, wait a minute. You all look like 2000 Knox County. They're up to 29,000 tons. So maybe we ought to start thinking about getting after it before we lose 29,000 tons here. So we've been more rapidly able to address the denial that exists that it won't happen here. That's what this rangeland science is able to help us do and this technology behind it. Now I have to go all the way to Arthur County, Nebraska, the very western edge of the Sandhills. That's where I don't see yield gaps. This is the signal we want in rangelands. This is what our recommendations and guidance should be saying, right? We want to prevent losses in agricultural production, prevent losses in habitat. But are there early warning signals? So that's 1990 Arthur County, and that's 2020. So yes, right? And it's following the trend of everywhere that we've seen. And this haze, right? This would be so simple if we got after this now. We've just never prevented these things because we're better ambulance driver than preventative healthcare professionals in this field. So yeah, but we have the technology to start to do it. We've got the leadership and expertise to start to be able to move how we strategize on this issue. But I think it's really important for people to understand our conclusions and the science. These are the facts of the Great Plains. Not a single county has restored yield after its woody encroachment starts to ramp up. So there are 0 success stories relative to traditional restoration on rangeland production at the scale of a county after woody encroachment starts to increase significantly. Even worse is that there's not a single county ever to prevent woody encroachment from increasing. So basically, I like to say now as a rangeland scientist, I guarantee you'll have drought, and I guarantee you will lose production to woody encroachment until somebody shows a different way at these scales. Stole this slide from Jeff Nichols, who's state range specialist here in Nebraska. NRCS, right? It was born because we needed to make sure our practices were sustainable to prevent the consequences that come with large scale transitions in vegetation. And we're showing the data, right? It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen in this short punctuated period. We're talking about large scale vegetation collapse, and we're having these long-term changes of major significance to our system. This is what our bigger mission is, right? As an entire profession. And that's what we're up against. It requires bold actions and rethinking how we've approached the stewardship of our resources. And so I'm here to say that a new strategy is available based on the leadership of the states, tied to the kind of data we had at a national level. And this actually just got extended. So a huge thank you to Rob Lawson, the state con of Nebraska NRCS. So I was asked to come in as a science advisor to say our strategy isn't working. We need a better strategy, in terms of the science, the guidance, the extension, if we're going to be able to deal with this and have better outcomes that we want. So we worked on creating that strategy, and I just wanted to call out this reducing woody encroachment in grasslands, that guide. We collaborated with multiple contributors from land grant institutions across the Great Plains. And the philosophy behind this is just very simple. What did we do that we know doesn't work after the last 50 years of kind of brush management? What we did was we cleared trees and we chased them into these other areas. Well, what happens? Well, this dispersal and recruitment of that woody plants is driven by seed, which becomes seedlings. And there was new paper that's actually just got published by Dylan Fogarty in my lab, where in the sandhills, recruitment, 95% of recruitment happens within 2 football fields of a seed source. So this 2 football fields, right? If we don't manage that, what does it become? It becomes mature seed-bearing trees. And that means that when that happens here, you lose what's intact grassland. Well, we never even thought to look here. We're so busy looking here and cutting down trees, we didn't even think about that this was contaminated with this area that we didn't want. So you have to manage this if you want to have success. So instead of chasing the problem and watching grasslands lose, anchor to your best areas and work the other direction. And where we see producers doing that across multiple areas, we've seen better outcomes and better wins. So we've got to put our practices in the right place, right? And be smarter with risk, across this entire landscape. So there is a major potential to use that toolkit and use the kind of processes that we have to just better manage this whole situation, this whole issue. But we're dealing with like decades and generations of doing the opposite. So we have a big literacy curve to get over. But wow, greater than 20,000 copies at the request of people were printed, distributed, recommended. There's things here that people are saying are useful in western rangelands of Utah, Oregon, et cetera. This is just a smarter approach to deal with invasions overall and woody encroachment. So I'm going to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole here because you can see why this could be so important for us. We have to manage the encroachment as a process, not just identify one part of it and say, hey, we'll treat a symptom. So all we managed was the spread. So that's what you're seeing here over the left, right? All this haze here, that's all cedar trees in the Nebraska sandhills. It's the edge of biome collapse. This looks like intact grassland. There's not a tree on it here. But in actuality, it's not intact because this is undergoing the blue cycle, right? This is 2 football fields in this example. So that's contaminated by seed. So how do we start to manage that? And how do we start to think about it? Well, what happens if we do what we kept doing? And I'm going down the rabbit hole here because I think it's so important given the diversity of people we have in this state, across state offices and everything else. These are encroached acres. This is contaminated by seed. That's the dispersal zone. This is what's intact. If your goal is to keep these things intact, right? Not only do we know the risk that's driving this landscape, not only can we quantify it, what did we do? Well, we just managed the red zone here. So that in this example would literally, based on NRCS payment scenarios, would cost $109,000 to manage that cover in the red. And then we do no management in the yellow. Well, what happens? This is not restored. This is still has seed in it because we'll do like a big brush management, mechanical clearing. Well, what happens over time is now this gets mature woody plants, and what was green is no longer green. It's now contaminated by seed. That's why we're chasing biome collapse. So what do? Well, now that happens and we ask people to manage it again. So we reapply brush management, and you get the horror story and the not so funny joke from Texas where you sell the ranch 3 times to pay for brush management. But now it costs even more because you have more acres to manage. So this costs $189,000. And now you have to manage everywhere. So the good old days of range management, where you only had to manage portion of the woody plant problem, is now everywhere on every inch of your rangeland. This is what we did, and this is why this strategy is not working. So what if we just recognize that seed dispersal drives encroachment and risk? So how would we do it differently? Well, we would defend the core, right, and do more preventative care. So we would use a whole host of tools, right, that are potentially useful in this to be able to manage seedlings in that area and so forth. And I'll make a special note, right? That's why we discounted prescribed fire and what indigenous groups did in their traditional ecological knowledge. Only fire managed the entire encroachment process with a single shot, right? It's the only thing consumes seed and that can, right, like consume mature encroaching trees. So if you don't use fire, you have to use a multiple host of other products. And so that's $6,000, less than $6,000 to manage that area if we got ahead of it using NRCS payment codes. Then you could grow the core if you're anchored there and it's stable and use these kind of practices there. If you do that, right, like we're starting to get this intact landscape back and make this process easier again on us. So this defend the core, grow the core mentality, right, this is starting to be the capturing the minds of everybody and just thinking about how we train. So I just want you to see like how this mentality and this kind of thought process is now taking off. This was an hour-long episode that was on RFD TV, Cattleman to Cattleman, that Michael Margot, as part of his leadership, talking about what was happening. Just watch this.
So eastern red cedar kind of takes over, as we call it, invasive, because it comes in and just builds on your grassland, reducing your amount of grazing acres, for your livestock, which really affects your bottom line when it comes to a grazing type program through your livestock.
Over time, and it kind of sneaks up on you, you can imagine, I see a few small cedars, and then eventually they become larger and they become seed producing, and those just end up creeping across the landscape.
We've got to do something. We've got to react quickly, because now it is almost beyond what we can do. We are the front line.
I believe this is becoming a war against the woody encroachment in Nebraska as more and more landowners becoming aware of the threat and the shift in the biome. It's not just a localized problem on localized ranches. It's a biome threat. It's a biome problem. The grasslands of the Great Plains are under this threat of the woody encroachment.
That's the kind of narrative you're starting to see, and we don't see changes in how we think, right, and literacy that fast. I mean, we're getting rapid awareness and understanding of what's happening in our rangelands from producers, partners, right, NGOs, agencies, all of it. We're putting it into a better plan, and we're being able to start to think and manage at multiple scales. So we can anchor to more intact areas and try and figure out how we can start to keep those intact and defend them. Really refining that with more field inventory, right, that escapes what we can see from remote sensing. Overlay additional data on wildlife, water values, where it's critical that we don't have wildfire problems, right, like school funding lands, all of that kind of stuff, these important cultural resource tied to grasslands. And we can identify landowners that are ready to move and act, and we're seeing that take off now, and co-produce these scenarios that are more successful than what we did in the past. This is where we're heading. So the next 3 years, what you're going to see is we're going to have better outcomes. We're already seeing it in some of the data. We're adapting over time. There's better communication success stories. This is the new plan, the new process, and we're actually building resilience back into grasslands, which we've lacked. So this is what's starting to move in terms of this kind of data. I want to show you, though, this interesting part of what's being adopted in the scale of the conversation with multiple partners here. So for the first time, right, not too long ago, this kind of data, science, better strategy, right, the vulnerability guide, that's the principles that are adopted in NRCS's first ever biome framework for conservation action. This is huge. Usually we do this after endangered species regulation threatens to kick in. And it's like, oh, hey, we have to scale up how we think. The Great Plains is doing it before the threat of regulations kicking in. I don't know that I've ever heard or seen that as a scientist where we have that kind of adoption and leadership. So that's really impressive. That's the first time that's happened. And that's this Working Lands for Wildlife biome framework on the left. That helps provide better national guidance to scale. And that scaling is important, right? 3 billion birds lost in grasslands. We have beef industry talking about this, like what we care about on rangelands, right? These two things are working together now in terms of rangelands are important for a host of things. And those products and these outcomes occur at scale. Well, the NRCS state leadership responded overnight, and it's like, wow, we can better manage this issue. So 10 million acres overnight gets dedicated to this, and this is starting to grow further. You're seeing that be grown through things like Great Plains Grassland Initiatives, where the last bigger grasslands and so forth are being identified as critical to the resources of these states. So Oklahoma establishes GPGI, Kansas has their GPGI, Nebraska, right? GPGI. And South Dakota had its first kind of pilot meeting statewide last week, coming together with multiple partners and groups to try and conserve the last bigger grasslands that are remaining and address the drivers of large-scale grassland loss. This was a training video. I just kind of wanted to show the graphic. It's really interesting watching these kind of graphics where GIS people are just able to walk through how we're training on this issue now. So I'm not going to show that here, but just to say this is statewide trainings being done with that data at the fingertips of any GIS specialist, and they communicate it so simply, right? Here's where risk is increasing on the landscape. But we have the first ever now national policy in the ag industry. So if you don't know about this, National Cattlemen's now says, right, in their Property Rights Environmental Management Committee, whereas woody encroachment is quickly consuming rangelands, and a dedicated statement of the need for increased funding with partners to manage that and to achieve these goals at national levels through partnerships. So I've never seen for woody encroachment in U.S. rangelands that the issue is now so important, right? Which makes sense, 22.4 million tons. We have national policy in ag industry, and rangelands are usually taken for granted in that. This is a big issue to that group. Kansas has the same storyline on this, tied to how important these GPGI and industry discussions are. This is also on that RFD TV show.
We're trying to fight back. It's coming at us. And the program, the GPGI, and the NRCS is helping us to meet that enemy as it's coming at us.
We can move into an area, execute a brush management contract on it, clear it of trees, and we feel really good about it. And then 2-3 years later, we see all these seeds coming back. And so the seedlings absolutely are a problem because they're making seed as well. And so to address that seed bank, or the seed pressure, so to speak, is huge.
You have to expand out and look at the landscape, because especially with woody encroachment, is you can do everything perfectly inside your fence. If your neighbor isn't doing anything, you will lose. That is what it is.
So you're just seeing that increased sense of urgency, especially as you keep going south. Now, if it's not the cattle industry, right? If it's not the USDA NRCS, and if it's not that kind of side, we're seeing the same discussion now in the conservation community tied to grasslands. So take the bird community, right? Same kind of data. They took our data from woody encroachment and those early warning signals, combined it with land use conversion, and that's what you see on this map on the left. This has now been updated on their website. It's the Central Grasslands Assessment Map. But the point is, look at the green. That's what's truly intact that escaped the 2 drivers of grassland loss. In the updated map, that's 21% of our biome is left, 1/5. Not much of a biome anymore, right? Another 1/5 is at risk. It's either experiencing woody encroachment now, or it's at risk of cultivation and loss from it. Well, the point is that grassland birds have been declining more than any other group of birds in North America. And that was in the State of the Birds report. When they took our data and overlaid it with where bird populations are increasing or stable, what do you know? Like, our grassland birds require habitat at scale, right? So that's what the map looks like. So if we want to defend working lands, if we want to have bird populations and avoid the amount of endangered species discussions that people are concerned about in Great Plains grasslands, you keep the green green, right? Defend core areas. The large intact habitat's really important. And grassland birds are highly sensitive to woody encroachment and the fragmentation of that habitat. So the bird groups, right? They're talking about international biome discussion. First time that's ever happened. First time ever, Great Plains Grassland Biome Extension Partnership is coming to a place near you in 2023. We're literally meeting here now, talking about how we can better communicate this and train on it and get the word out. And an extension in private lands is critically important. And the relationship with USDA and NRCS on private lands is critically important. So we're taking the vulnerability guide and working on developing a field training handbook to where this is more easily digestible, easier to use, easier to think through, and easier to win. And that's right, that's part of our jobs. So I just wanted to give this glimpse of like everybody coming together, showing what's been working, understanding how to think in complex systems, the reality of risk and what's playing out in Kansas, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Nebraska, how this relates to cheatgrass invasion and their thinking out west. Our profession's getting better. Our science strategies, our extension will be better. So we're well positioned to help you out as this keeps moving forward. And that's going to be then what it's all about, because if we have better strategies, better practice implementation, better collaboration and partnership, and just better thinking, the people that actually live on the land that are most affected by this have a better chance. And that's what's going to be happening going forward, is a series of demonstrations of success and just better outcomes on these rangelands. So we've given this example before, but the Les Canyons and their desire in Nebraska, they gave us all these areas here that are shaded here, kind of transparent white. That is what they own. As a community of ranchers across a 330,000 acre biologically unique landscape that had a previously former endangered beetle on it, the bearing beetle, this is what they own. That is their goal, is to conserve that. And they've come together to do that as a group. And we've been able to quantify increased grassland biodiversity and richness on those areas and published it. A master's student recently showed increasing population trends in the American bearing beetle, like an impossible outcome, a previously endangered species. We have reduction in wildfire danger in this landscape. That's in review. We have increased production in this landscape. That landscape that they own is worth $250,000 more every year because we've been able to close that yield gap and continuing to move that trajectory. These are outcomes that matter here, right? And they matter to the people that live there. And we can copy this model of success and grow it. And we can communicate that. So their story has been featured as the rare example, right? This is an impossible problem. We don't have county level success stories on this issue in rangelands. But this group has large scale success. National Geographic paid attention, cattlemen groups paying attention, Audubon communicating it, Pheasants Forever, beef industry, right? Fence Post. That's the community and so forth, and just talking about how unique this is and the fact we can finally start to get ahead and finally start to do something about it. So really appreciate you being able to go through all this. I thought this was a better way of just communicating, like, our outcomes help drive implementation. I think that's what SEEP's really about. It's the ability to show the outcomes we want through this process of technology, driving implementation associated with outcomes, and better strategies, better frameworks. That's what we're doing. And that means maybe we'll have big grasslands for future generations, right? Like maybe we'll have some of these left. And that seems like a really important, noble thing given how rare grasslands are on the planet today. So thanks again. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all and really appreciate the job everyone's trying to do leadership on this issue. So thanks again.
Well, thank you, Duroc. That was a lot of information to go through. I know there's a lot there, and there's a whole lot more beyond what you presented. We got some comments in the chat. Can you talk a little bit about how, like, the Great Plains Grassland Initiative in the states that you've been working in are, actually changing the way we do business and some of the main practices that we're using to fight woody encroachment in areas that are like just seedlings, and it's not a big problem. It's not a problem that you recognize as easily, and we're starting to recognize more now.
Yeah, great question. And there's a lot there, but I think really simply what makes it unique is this is landowner led at its core. So what happened is landowners, right? The identification of the cultural will of saying, wait, we need to be able to do this differently. So landowners came together, kind of like the Les Canyons, and look at what we could do together and scale up. And an example was in Kansas. After one meeting, they started talking about how to attack this, how to do it as a community. And they sent a 600,000 acre map in south central Kansas to Karen Woodrich, the state conservationist at the time, right? Saying, this is what we want to do. We want to be able to do this. Well, then the Flint Hills, Chase County sent a map. So it was born because landowners were saying we need to do something different and we need to rethink how we approach it. And that was supported by state leadership and then trickling back down through the local field offices. And Oklahoma, then same kind of model, Nebraska. So it's landowner led, supported with our agencies and informed by the science. Like, it's the good old days of land grant, USDA, NRCS, and producers, right? Like, we're just doing what we used to do, and we've missed that a little bit. So that dynamic, I think, is what's the most important piece. Is it's at the core. And then they're identifying how to attack the entire encroachment process, and we can track that, and we can see if they're being successful.
So we got a comment from Colorado saying that, there needs to be 20% brush on there before you can use brush management to get cost share on it. So I guess in the Great Plains where you're working in some of these, early encroachment areas, have we solved that riddle?
Well, hey, things can change, right? So it used to be discussed that way in Nebraska too. We got to wait till there's 10% cover. It used to be said that way with some of the stuff in the Sage-Grouse Initiative. So yeah, things can change, and it's really important to rethink maybe how we're using that and how useful brush management could be if we adjusted and just tweaked the radio dial. But one solution was that, well, if those are our current standards or specs or whatever, one solution is like, what can we do to get out ahead of it? So one idea that was born that's being implemented was to use integrated pest management to basically, apply that PAMS-based approach. That style has been something that's being experimented with and being used as well. But I do think, yeah, we ought to look at and rethink what our techs are, right, for some of these practices, and could they be used more effectively? Sure.
And there was another comment that just came in about maybe using prescribed fire in some of these early encroachment areas. Is that taking off?
So the biggest limitation for prescribed fire is we couldn't get people to burn before you transition to woody dominance. So in places that don't have a fire culture, a fire area, and we've published this 10 years ago, fire in the Great Plains will follow collapse to woody dominance because it's the only economical thing at that point, right? Hundreds of dollars per acre. We just can't manage enough land with the big Tonka toys. So our problem was more that, right, the stakeholder groups, the landowners, so forth, well, we don't have a resource concern yet, so I don't want to use fire and burn up my grass or whatever else. Well, now we're starting to identify that, wait, there is a concern. And so, yeah, now you're starting to see adoption of fire in discussions in areas ahead of time. And part of that's the awareness deal. And part of that's then that one in terms of the NRCS as a practice, we're able to implement those there now. And it is more effective and cheaper and so forth, but you don't have to use it if you're not ready. You just got to manage things earlier. So yeah, great question there and great point.
Right. Yeah, so I guess that One other thing before we leave, I know we're kind of running out of time, but is there comparisons with the sagebrush biome, similar work that's going on? That was a question in the chat.
So yes, not only comparisons, right? We keep bouncing the discussions back and forth, right? So there's the cheatgrass challenges and how to manage invasive cheatgrass and so forth. I think there's discussion about them doing a vulnerability guide similar to what we did to better manage annual invasions and cheatgrass. Defending the core, right? We've worked in that and shown examples from here with woody encroachment, and that cheatgrass is doing the same thing. How can we defend the core, manage earlier, be more preventative, and then mitigate areas that are more infested? All of that communication, it's the same philosophy. It's just an invasion problem in both of these. How do we better manage it? We have the data as part of a national science team, right, with Montana as well, to track it and communicate outcomes tied to this that we're trying to search for and get. And I keep talking about that because that's what I'm dying for, right? Like, I don't want to talk about biome consequence anymore. I want to talk about some wins. We just don't have large scale wins on these, and we're going to be looking for them nationally. Absolutely.
We greatly appreciate your help in tracking and chasing those wins. Better to chase wins than the collapsing biome. So with that, we're at the top of the hour. So thanks, Duroc. I'm going to turn it back over to Amy to close out. And so it's all yours, Amy.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Twidwell, for sharing your excellent presentation and insights today. Your enthusiasm and passion truly is inspiring. So thank you so much. A big thank you also to Louis Aspie and to Charlie for being with us, and to my colleague, Katie Saratani, for her assistance with today's webinar logistics. Once again, I really encourage you to visit the Conservation Outcomes webinar series webpage. We're going to have that link there in the chat. A lot of the resources and links that were mentioned today are there for you on that one pager of additional resources, in addition to the slide deck. We wanted to give you a quick heads up about our next Conservation Outcomes webinar, which is February the 23rd at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Time. That is going to feature Chambers English from University of Georgia, and he's going to focus on forest management for water yield. So please make sure to tune in to that. We're going to post the recording of today's webinar next week there at our Conservation Outcomes webpage. We also have recordings of previous webinars as well, and more instructions on how to subscribe to that important GovDelivery subscription service that will keep you in the loop about future webinars. We really hope to see you again here in this space, and thank you so much for your time today. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.